Libraries continue to be one of our most important community institutions. They are trusted and safe places where equity. Libraries continue to be one of our most important community institutions. They are trusted and safe places where equity and diversity are not buzzwords, but at the core of the services they provide. Libraries inspire and support lifelong learning, from literacy programs for children, computer classes for seniors, to business plan workshops for aspiring entrepreneurs. At the DC Public Library Foundation, our philanthropic investments enhance, engage, and expand programs where private support can have an outsized impact. A great example of this is the Foundation's work with the Teen Council and signature teen programming, Know Your Power. By creating spaces and resources for teens and youth to express themselves through art, writing, and most importantly, through their input and hands-on leadership, we ensure our libraries can effectively serve the communities that surround them.
It makes me feel really good knowing that people feel more inclined to come to the library and ask about things and ask for help, seeing somebody so close in age to them. It gives you so many skills that you wouldn't have gotten if you didn't work at a library.
The DC Public Library Foundation is more than programs and events. It's being able to empower people with tangible skills and creating an institution that will continue to inspire lifelong learning.
Good evening, everyone. Hi. It's so great to see everyone here. My name is Tora Burns. I'm the Reading Programs Coordinator for DC Public Library. Welcome to the MLK Memorial Library. On behalf of the DC Public Library, it's my great pleasure to welcome E.B. Zaboy and Jennifer Baker for what I know will be a fascinating and timely conversation. For 50 years, the MLK Library in our archives on the district history has served as a resource to journalists, researchers, and authors. Our vast collection is filled with stories that create space for dynamic community discussions and human connections for the young and the old. On the rare chance that you do not have a library card, I implore you to get one before you leave. Raise your hand if you have a library card. So if I don't see your hand raised, I expect to see you at the welcome desk getting a library card. If you are new to the district or surrounding communities, we invite you to get your library card and connect with us in person, online, or through the DC Public Library app and learn how you can help find your story. We would love to thank Well Read Black Girl for its for its continued support in bringing diverse topics and renowned authors to our space. Our partners at the DC Public Library Foundation are proud to support this partnership and will distribute copies of today's work for visitors tonight. To introduce our guest, give her a round of applause. Please welcome Glory Edom, the founder of Well Read Black Girl. Whoop, whoop.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to see everyone. I'm going to make my way up to my seat here. How's everyone doing? Good. This is our last book club of the summer, so I'm so excited to see everyone's faces, but we'll start back up in the fall. I am going to read the bios of our two extraordinary authors who are not only friends, but just simply incredible human beings. We're so honored to have E.B. and Jen here with us today. I'm going to start with E.B.'s bio. E.B. Zaboy is a New York Times bestselling author of American Street, a National Book Award finalist of Pride, a contemporary remix of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and My Life as an Ice Cream Sandwich, her middle grade debut. She's also the co-author of the Walter Award and LA Times book prizing Punching the Air with prison reform activist Dr. Yusuf Salim of the Exonerated Five, which was also shortlisted for the UK's Yoto Carnegie, am I saying that correctly? Sorry, medal. E.B. is the editor of Black Enough, Stories of Being Young and Black in America, and her debut picture book, The People Remember, received a Coretta Scott King Honor Award. Her most recent book, Nigeria Jones, is what we'll be discussing today, and I'm incredibly so honored to have her come up to the stage. Come up, Evie. I'll scoot over. You're welcome. I'll have you sit right here. Yep, I'll sit in the middle. Now we're gonna bring up Jen Baker. I'm gonna read her bio as well. Jen Baker. Jen Baker was named the 2019 Publishers Weekly Star Watch Superstar because of her varied work championing diversity in publishing and has made her an indispensable fixture in the book business, which is very true. She's incredibly talented. Her essay, What We Aren't, has also been listed as a notable essay in the Best American Essays in 2018. Her short story, The Pursuit of Happiness, was nominated for a Pushcart Prize in 2017. She's also the editor of Everyday People, The Color of Life, a short story anthology, and her YA novel, Forgive Me Not, was published just this week. Congratulations, this is her debut. She's a publishing professional with over 20 years experience in a range of roles, editor, podcast. Her podcast is incredible. Please look it up, Minorities in Publishing. And she used to serve as the contributing editor to Electric Lit. Let's welcome Jen up to the stage. Yes, switch. All right. Give you this one? Yeah. All right, are our mics on?
Yeah.
All right. So I really want to start just to say both of your books are about Black girlhood. And that is something that's been so crucial to explore it's always important for us to look at black girlhood, but the essence of it, the beauty of it, the importance, the complication, all of that comes up so beautifully in both of your books. And that is why I wanted to do this pairing, because you have both written this incredible story about what it is to embody Black girlhood, but also embody all the interior of that, right? There's so many images of what it means to be a young Black girl, but in the writing, you can really see it with such clarity and love and compassion. And so I'm gonna start with you, Evie, because you have written so many incredible books, and the essence of all of them always have this tenderness and this level of self-compassion. And I'm really curious to know how you've reached that level of understanding the voice of young Black girls in a way that comes across so clearly and with so much love.
Thank you, Glory. Hi, good evening, everyone. I see some familiar faces, some friends in the house, and I always love coming back to DC. My daughter started her sophomore year at Howard, so this is just a stop. And my oldest is finishing her senior year at Amherst. I gotta shout out the PWI too. There's balance in our house. There's some balance. And I am so appreciative of the work that you do, Glory. I could not, you know what, Jen? When I started writing 20 years ago, I was trying to get published my entire adult life, and there wasn't this sort of community space for our books 20 years ago. So even though I got published late in my trajectory, I could not have imagined that there'd be a space like Well-Read Black Girl, that there'd be like this library collaboration, that I'd have colleagues, so many colleagues. And when I was starting out, there were elders, but not necessarily peer groups. So our colleagues are our peers. Yep. So this is, what they say, rising tides lift all boats kind of things. Yep. So this is what is happening. I can honestly say for everyone here, I think you already know, that nowhere in other forms of media, be it TV and films, can we have stories about Black girlhood. It's only existing in books in the way that they are, and especially in the YA space. Mm-hmm. So if you are looking for coming of age stories, if you have daughters, if you are a woman or non-binary, you want to know what's happening, the internal struggles of Black girls and women, it's now, it's here and now. It's a small percentage comparatively, but we have options now, right? You have girlhood and mass incarceration. We have girlhood and militant families, girl police brutality, fantasy, science fiction. So I love being in this space right now. What was the question?
No, that's perfect. It's the question is just, how did you come to this space of seeing it so clearly? Because anytime I read any of your books, I'm I see myself. Even if it's not immediately familiar, there's a feeling that comes when I read your books of just oh, I can relate to that, and it doesn't feel far-fetched. It just feels so authentic and real. Mm-hmm. And I'm just how, because it's not only the way you write, it's the craft. It just feels very organic. And maybe that's not even a question. Maybe it's a testimony of what you evoke when someone reads your work.
Yeah, and I wasn't innovating anything. One of my idols is Edwidge Danticat, because I'm Haitian born.
Yes.
And Octavia Butler, and I've written about Octavia Butler, was writing about, speculative fiction. There were examples, and we're standing on shoulders. Mm-hmm. But those examples were several years older than me at the time. Mm-hmm. Now, my examples are my peers. I have contemporaries whose books I love. I'm a fan of people. I don't talk about it a lot, but there are people who are publishing alongside me who are probably a few years younger, whose books I love, and I'm opening up the page. Let me see what they're doing. Right. So this is what I love about the space that I'm taking up right now, that we're taking up.
And so that question for Jen, this is your first debut, this is your first YA, and you have such a clear perspective with your characters. And I'm just really, same question, how did you decide to write about Black girlhood, and why was it important for you to tell this coming of age story?
I think for me, it starts with the question. And so the question was, what does forgiveness look like? And I was watching this show, I don't know if y'all know the show Forgive or Forget. It was a syndicated show with Mother Love. Mm-hmm. And then what do you do when you make mistakes? You bring people on national TV. And so someone would bring someone on TV, and they would say, so I cheated on my wife, da 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 da, and the audience would go, ooh, what? And then they'd be like, well, okay, go to that door and see if she's there. And if the wife was there or whatever, then that means they're open to trying to forgive you. If they weren't, then they appear on a screen. And that comes up in the first chapter, a screen. And they say, I ain't come here, you're trash, and da-da-da-da-da. And then, you know, it'd be very Jerry Springer-esque. And I just thought, well, what if this was how detention worked, or criminal justice worked? And then more so, what if it worked for juveniles? Because then that's taking away even more power from a younger generation. And the characters came very clearly, because this is a dual perspective. So you hear from Violetta, who is the catalyst, and it is her story, but you also hear from her brother, because in this world, the people who are the quote-unquote victims decide what happens to the person who's the offender. And so because the family is making that decision, that is kind of where his voice comes in, is because you can see how the decision-making is in tandem with how the Department of Corrections is telling this family how the juvenile system, justice system works. It's effective. They're using these words, right? And so we hear politicians use these words, and we hear so many people in levels of power say these words of what needs to happen to our communities, because Black people are the most disproportionately in juvenile and in adult incarceration, in both, if you look in the binary, if we're not even including the groups that aren't counted, right? And so from there, I also felt like I wanted to know what this looks like in terms of like misogyny and all these other things, because what if a young girl who, she's biracial, so she's Black and Chinese, and she's very Black appearing, because she's very dark brown skin, what happens when you make a mistake, and we're not talking about whether you're innocent or guilty, right? We're talking specifically about if you admit to what you did, how does society look at you, and what is this version of kind of punishment or rehabilitation that happens? And restorative justice is just not really a thing here in this world, in this book, but also in this nation, if we're looking at how criminal justice actually works, and reading about abolition, and reading about why reform is not necessarily the way to go, depending on how you feel, depending on what you read. And all that built in tandem of like, well, what does forgiveness look like in the most extreme case? And why, if you look at Violetta, who identifies as female, and her brother, who identifies as male, why does her brother get more leniency than her? And that became like this whole bigger picture that unravels as I like develop the characters and the plot and all those things, because I really just came from a place of like, well, what does forgiveness look like? Because I can be petty too, y'all. I can hold a grudge. I'm an Aquarius. But also it's like sometimes you move on, and what do you need to move on for that?
You know, I'm going to follow up that question, the answer with, because now I'm thinking about your writing process, right? So you had this idea about forgiveness and redemption, and what does it mean to kind of resurrect from something that in this world, there's not necessarily like a fair sense of accountability.
Right.
So is there, and then to make this even more complicated, this is a book for young adults, right? That are trying to determine what that means in their own lives. So I guess my question is, how does your writing process, or the way you craft a story, allow you to tell what feels like it can be a very traumatic story, but still leave space for it to be hopeful and inspirational in a way to like also show the duality of all those things? Like you can make a mistake and you can gain forgiveness, or you may not gain forgiveness. Like what does that look like, and how do you kind of make that messaging clear for a young person?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Thank you, because I think it taps into what E.B. was saying about peer groups, because E.B., we've had this conversation, right? Leah, we've had, like Leah Henderson's amazing writer who has a bunch of wonderful picture books, a middle grade out. So we've had that conversation. Ebony Liddell, whose book is coming out in paperback in 2 weeks, Love Radio. We've had that conversation, right? And so we've all had and Bethany Morrow, who's in the back, who's done
There's
several,
so many authors
so
here.
many wonderful YA books and all this stuff.
room.
Yeah, and Bethany's, whose books does like this wonderful fantasy and looks at, and we've had that conversation. So it's like a lot of us are constantly, and Renee, who kindly blurbed the book, we have that conversation. All like, we don't want to re-traumatize people. We want to dig into what these questions are and these stories, and we don't want to water it down, but we also don't want to feed into, I think, what we can absorb over time, right? And what has been, because I know I've absorbed it and have to like recondition myself of like, okay, am I just putting in something really violent because I feel like I have no other way of producing tension? That's not necessarily to me craft. That's me just kind of fulfilling a certain need, but not recognizing that, like, in the end, I want young readers to really feel for these characters in a deep way. And you know, there were moments in this where I struggled with Violetta because I knew where I wanted her to go, but I didn't know how to get her there. And ultimately, I just wanted her to have power. And I want anyone to recognize at any point in time in their life, you have power, right? You can be in the worst job, you can be at school, and there's this authority figure, right? There's an authority figure who might be able to fire you, who might be able to give you a bad grade, who might be able to kick you, but you still have power, right? And I think that's the point of capitalism, and that's the point of even incarceration. It's to extract that. You don't have power anymore. It's like, actually, I do. Yeah. I may not be able to make every decision that leads to something that I need, but I have autonomy over my body right now. Yeah. I have the decision not to work with you, even if that might mean I struggle for a month. I have these things. And that was crucial for me, is to make sure that these characters who are teenagers have power. And they have agency, and they're making decisions, and they're realizing something about what society is telling them as kids of color, and what they can do for themselves to give themselves something to cling to, and also to surround them with love, right? Like, each character, even though it's very hard for them to talk to people, and, you know, we're all struggling with communication. It doesn't stop. You know, you can be 50, 60, 40 something, and you're just like, that probably could have come out way better. or like, it sounds like you're saying the same thing, and you're yelling at each other, and you're like, da-da-da. You're literally saying the same thing, you guys. But they're surrounded by people who love and care for them. So even in the action of the parents, they're thinking they're doing the right thing. They're not necessarily, but it's coming from love and not from revenge or anything like that. And so those were the biggest things. It's like, okay, if I show that these characters are loved, if I show that they're gonna have agency, if I show that this is a topic that you can identify with at any age, then I feel like I'm doing my job, because I'm showing I care about them, rather than I'm just trying to entertain you for the sake of entertainment because this is what I think might be interesting.
I'm really taken by your concept of power, and I'm going to pose that question to Evie, because in your book, Nigeria Jones, like, Nigeria immediately reads to me as someone who is full of agency, really understands their place in the world, but is struggling with identity in a different sense, because they're coming of age and they're questioning and pushing back, right? So compared to Jen's take of like power and agency, how like, I'm just curious of what your thoughts are when you're developing a character and making them feel self-sufficient and clear and powerful. What are the steps that you take, and particularly with this character? Because immediately I was very drawn to her and felt like she, even when she was questioning, she still felt very certain and confident. And you've also placed her in this very radical, you know, unconventional by some, you know, by societal norms household, right? So can you talk a little bit about that, what that power looks like, and what that sense of identity and radical feeling?
I think Jen's character, Violetta, and Nigeria are in conversation a little bit. And they're both dealing with institutions.
Yes.
And we have to look at family as an institution as well, because society tells us two-parent household, heteronormative, nuclear family. But she's coming from a militant separatist community where her father is this is DC, I can say this. Her father is like a Dr. Umar Johnson figure. And that's my low-hanging fruit. But, and readers read it because it's set in Philadelphia. It is a nod to the MOVE organization, if you're familiar with MOVE. But a lot of people don't learn in school about the separatist militant communities that existed in the 60s as well. The New Africa Republic being one of them. Down in Jackson, Mississippi, and out of that community came some mayors, and the mayor of Jackson as well, the Lumumbas, coming out of that community. So I wanted to put Afrocentrism, Pan-Africanism, and militancy in a YA novel. I have some experience with that. So in that sense, she does feel like she's in prison because while we think, like for those of us who care about social justice issues, we have an idea of what a utopian society might look like. We are fighting for social change. Maybe some of us may lean towards socialism. We just like want a true democracy. But there are people who think this is the way, this is how it's going to work, and we're going to do it. We're not going to wait for a seat at the table. We're not going to sit at the table at all. So that's her father. But here she is, a 16-year-old, thinking that she lives in an ideal community, and her home is considered like a commune. Yeah. It's an intentional community. Yeah. And some people might call her community a cult. But cult comes from the word culture. You know, I'm using all these little things, quips that show up in the book. But she wants, like, what else is out there? And I want to say that her father really has some strong opinions about white people. And we know we have people we know people like that. And she's curious. You know how young people are. Like, you know, you tell them don't touch that hot pot. You know, she's going to want to find out, are they as evil as, you know, my father says they are. Her mother signs her up for a Quaker school. And I bring all these things up to show that there were separatist communities in this country, the Quakers being one of them. We know about the Amish, which is why I said it in Philadelphia. Who gets to be sovereign in this country? Who gets to separate and divest and live peacefully in that divestment? And another layer is, who are we fighting for within social justice movements? And is it for the rights of hetero, cisgender black men only? And here she is, a girl, like, what about me? What about my rights? And all these ideas about body autonomy, which you just mentioned, Jen, show up in this story as well. So there is a conversation with, what are the boxes that we put black girls in? What are the boxes that we put black femininity in whatever ways that it shows up? How do we constrain that in our society? And what are the ways in which the young people try to break out of that? And this is where agency comes in. And I think maybe you agree, Jen, that I write for young people because these are where the questions are being asked. And maybe it's a little laziness on my part where I don't have to answer them. Because when they're, you know, at the end of the book, they're still 16 or 17. They haven't reached adulthood yet, and you don't have to tie everything up with a neat bow because they're still figuring it out. So the agency is within the course of the novel, and the answers probably don't come at the end. They begin the process of questioning. And when I was at a Karen Hunter radio show, if y'all familiar with her radio show, she pushed me to talk about rites of passages for young people. And how there isn't rites of passage. Like, we think it's prom and it's graduation, but the indigenous communities have ways of showing young people that you are not a child anymore. This is adulthood. We're going to, like, have you see what death can be like so you can avoid it. And here are the things that you need to be a valuable member of society. Here is what you need to do. Here is how you need to walk, talk, present yourself so that you know you are no longer a child. You're stepping into the role of adulthood. And I think as young adult writers, this is what we do. And we don't have to be children. You don't have to be 21 or act like we're teens in order to connect with young readers. We can be elders imparting wisdom in a way that is not didactic and empathetic and sympathetic in order to show them the way and help them through their transition into adulthood.
Well, that poses another question for me because
you also do a great job of capturing a youthful voice. It sounds very authentic. It sounds like a young person would say that. So yes, you're not being didactic, but you do sound like a young person. So what is that? What is that practice of both of you? I'll pose that to both of you. So how do you capture, the voice of the youth? Because we are elders now, but we want to make sure the language sounds familiar. There's ease to it. There's something that they can like gravitate to, but also catch these lessons and see these rites of passages. Is that something? Are you like ear hustling and just like listening to the young people on the corner? Are your daughters giving you advice? Like for both of you, how did you capture their voice so beautifully? Like both, it sounds like young people.
You know what? We have not changed. We don't change as a society. I remember when my kids were just a few years younger, and my daughter is here now. I had them watch Cooley High, right? And they looking at it, oh, this was happening back in the day, And this was at the brink of like all the police brutality stuff that was happening, a few years ago. And Cooley High was set in the late 1960s, but put out in the 70s. And you could follow that trajectory with the 90s with Boys in the Hood, and you could follow that trajectory. And you're like, young people are young people are young people. And the only things that change, because we're in a capitalist society, is the stuff that we wear, the music that we listen to. The slang is different, but the energy is still the same. Okay. You could look at, I urge you, take a look at Cornbread Earl and Me. And Cooley High and what's happening, and they still like, oh, that's, you change the outfit, and you're like, this could be Gen Z right now. And I always love the memes when Gen X is pit against Gen Z with the music. And there was one where a young person, where his parents were making fun of what he's listening to, so he started rapping like a Slick Rick rhyme, and he's like, well, this is what y'all was lottie-dottie, who we like to party. And like, you're like, what the heck is that? So the language the energy is still the same. The language is different. As long as I do my research, like with everything else, right? Yeah. I was 16 in the 90s, and you capture the youthful energy of being insecure, having questions, being horny, being all of this, like wanting friends and not liking your parents and wanting to look good. All of that is the same across the board.
Yeah. I'm about to go watch Cooley High too.
That's good. I remember that. Holds up.
What about you? What research did you do to kind of capture Violetta's voice and make sure it sounded, the way you wanted it to?
In essence, I agree totally with what E.B. said, and also I relate to the characters. So sometimes, you pick a voice, right? You pick first person, third person, second person, and if I'm doing first person, that means I'm gonna live with you for a very long time, because I'm in your head, right? And then there's like, when you're third person, you can be a little arm's length, but you can do close and all that stuff. So they really had to speak to me for me to be able to invest a novel in two separate voices. And so they kind of sound like me in a way, in two different methods. Like Violetta and Vincent do sound very different. Yeah. Like Vincent is a bit more sarcastic, and that's me in some places. And then Violetta is kind of youthful me, the more reserved, the more questioning, but the more hesitant. And Vincent to me is a little bit more older me. And also in going back to what E.B. said about like how generations kind of cycle into one another, and they change, but they stay the same in terms of a lot of methodology. I think one of the biggest disappointments when I was a child teen to an adult, was thinking that adulthood meant people had it together. Yeah. You know what I mean? I thought, oh, we're only messy as teens.
No.
Adults are messy. Really messy, and we got to pay taxes. It's ridiculous. So I just kind of looked at it with the same respect of how I engage with people who are younger than me, that it's not like, oh, whipper. It's like, we're at the same level. Like if you're 16 and I'm in my 40s, we're at the same level. You're dealing with certain things, I'm dealing with certain things. But I'm not going to talk down to you. Oh, yeah. And so when I come to any character, but especially these teens, it's like, I get you because I've been in these situations where the emotional impact is similar. The situation is very different and one I'm manifesting and doing research on and getting feedback on. But the emotional impact, I identify with both of you of not being able to communicate, of being insecure, of feeling like you have to act in the way that society wants you to. And that doesn't stop, unfortunately. You change and circumstances either force you to change or don't. And so in that way, they always were consistent for me. And I started this book in 2014, so I lived with them for a long time that I just knew them after a while.
Yeah.
And I had to do the work to get to know them even better, but I just knew their voices because I just saw them in these two very specific ways that represented me at different times of my life.
Yeah, I'm glad you noted the year you started this book, because I think there's this like misconception of like, I have an idea, a year later I have a book, and the reality is it is such a long and laborious process that involves so many people. As I mentioned in your bio, you're also a really incredible editor. So how was this like, shifting your mind from editor Jen to writer Jen? How did the book evolve over that course of 2014 to 2023? Like what stayed on the page and what altered? And I also want to ask that to you too, Evie, because I know this idea sat with you for a very long time, and you had several books published before this came to light. So in that space, in that time, how did you as a person change? How did your writing change? How did your craft grow? So it's 2014, honey, that's long.
2014. And we sold the book in 2020, and then those big edits came over 2 years to the point where it wasn't done until 2022.
And also, this is a question that you can answer if you want, but did the reckoning of 2020 have any, did it add I don't know, did it give your book more attention or the idea more attention because it was about mass incarceration? Because everything that we're talking about now feels like it's part of the vocabulary. There is a idea, but in 2014, I don't know if that was as much, or the popularity of talking about mass incarceration, and do you see what I'm trying to say?
Oh yeah, for sure. I'll speak to that first because I believe Evie Punching the Air came out 2020, or was it 2021? Yeah.
Let me shout out Yusef Salaam. Y'all are familiar with Yusef Salaam.
Soon councilman.
Soon to be councilman Yusef Salaam. And his wife, Synovia Guillory, is right here. Hey, Synovia. And Synovia does a wonderful job of making sure that her children are well-read children, well-read Black children, and just follows me to all the book events. So we've both written about the prison industrial concept in different
we talked
ways.
about it.
Right.
Yeah, what you said.
And I just want to add that even while it was about a young man, I made sure to include a Black girl in the story because the character Amal had a love interest, Zenobia, which was based on Yusef's wife, Synovia. So when even when we're talking about Black men, and there haven't been, what you're doing is innovative in the way we haven't talked about Black girlhood in the incarceration in juvenile justice system. We don't talk about how the girls are affected by the boys, the mothers, aunties, girlfriends are affected by that. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't know that people were more interested in mass incarceration. I feel as though it's still a conversation, and I'm not as in it in terms of the abolitionists and the workers who are in this every day. I was just I did a lot of research. I got readers in that space who were incarcerated, who worked at Rikers and stuff like that also. But I just feel and maybe Evie, you can speak to this a little bit too, is I don't want to say people don't care. I just feel like that is not, when we talk about Blackness and BIPOC children, I don't feel like incarceration is at that top level. And this is still a hard thing to talk about for people because criminal justice, it's such a bigger conversation and it deserves so much nuance and there's so much complexity to it. And even in writing this book, that's what took so long, is to understand the complexity of the system, but also what I'm creating that is not too different from what's happening. There are these things called the trials that are a form of restorative justice. I use air quotes because, and also it's a form of rehabilitation. That's what they say. And that there are some weird things happening that people think are helping children process grief. Like a student of mine told me after this book was at the printer, I couldn't make any edits anymore. She works in California, and she said, oh, at our school, we reenact car accidents. We have the students reenact car accidents. Yeah, like so their classmates died in a car accident. And so someone at the school, someone thought that to reenact them once a year and then talk about drunk driving and da-da-da-da and car, you know, and all that stuff. And the teacher who was in my workshop said, this re-triggers me every year. And I was just like, well, why does anyone think that this is a good idea? But this is something that is enacted in a school, and they encourage these students to perform and react to being dead and to react to seeing a dead friend. I was like, that makes no sense to me. And it's wild to me because, again, I'm thinking about these things called rehabilitation and the trials, and I'm kind of doing things speaking to that. But this is happening. People are thinking these are good ideas to talk to children, but they're not talking to the children. They're doing this performance-based thing that they think will help them. And so, but you learn about all these weird things. And so that makes it more complex. I have to really develop the rules. I have to keep in mind that I care about these characters and I don't want to do the traumatizing thing for the sake of trauma. And as I'm reading more, as I'm hearing from people, the emotion is there, but there also has to be the recognition of like plausibility and logistics and all those things. And that takes time. That takes time for you to just keep learning, because the person who started writing this book was a lot more ignorant than the person who's standing up here right now and talking. And there's a lot for me to learn, obviously, continuously. And at the same time, I had to do that work over time. The more you get critique, the more you get feedback. And the more I went to people and said, can you read this? I trust you. I trust you. You're an educator. You're black. You're biracial. You're Asian. You're queer. You've been incarcerated. You've worked with incarcerated youth. Da 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 da. Because we need to hear from those communities as well to just understand what we can perpetuate in our ignorance. And well-intentioned is kind of a triggering word for me, right? Like the well-intentioned person can still cause a lot of harm. Yeah. And that's not where I want to come from. Like literally, if anyone had told me I had done something harmful that I couldn't undo or that I couldn't know how to fix, I would have given my publisher back their money. I would have said, take the money, I cannot do this. And so we had to get to this point where the kids came first, the community came first, and the story came first, and it had to be complex, and that's where all of that took time. And I'm just not fast. Yeah. I don't write every day. If I had to rely on writing to pay my bills and feed me, that would not be working out pretty well. So I always have a job so that I can write, and I have a little bit more freedom to write because I'm not relying on the check to be able to have that freedom. I deserve to be compensated, let's not forget, but I'm not relying on it in a way. And that's just how I operate. I just cannot work with that kind of hanging over my head in a way that I can just produce stories and be like, here's what I produced, either you're down with it or not. Okay, well, you're not. Here's what I produce. I'm not monogamous with my writing. So I'm writing multiple things at a time, which also adds to it. I'm not sitting here writing Forgive Me Not for 8 years. It's 8 years on and off, along with 4 other books that I'm writing. Yeah. So that's what takes the time.
And so, well, I want to know your timeline too. How are you writing all these books? How's it coming out?
You end up in a hamster wheel a little bit because capitalism. If I say I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to be a writer, and you get paid for a book, and that money runs out, and there's no time to ruminate, to find inspiration in the world, to be an artist. You gotta churn out the next one. And for me right now, I've 9 books in, 10th book coming out next year. So I have, and this it's not like something I'm very proud of because.
Why not?
Nap Ministry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, true.
We do
There's
deserve,
a nap revolution. If y'all don't know about it, get into it. Where you starting to, this is recorded?
Yeah, we laugh. Hey, Trisha. Hey, Nana.
No, meaning the idea is that when you are working, and you're proud of the book that you make, and slowly you start to peel away the layers of what goes into the, how what is it, the meat is made, how to,
Oh, the sausage.
how the sausage is made,
Yeah.
where others are profiting before I do, right?
Yeah.
And there are others profiting more so than we are. And you put all of us together writing our books and somebody's on top. You know, that pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
It's all it is. And you realize like we're over here writing our hearts out.
Yeah.
And this is a paper product for somebody else.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, this is a paper product, and they're pushing paper products. And if I allow myself to get into the weeds of paper products, I will lose inspiration.
Yeah.
I feel like James Baldwin said it in any sort of, I don't remember the exact quote, when you are aspiring to be in any space, you learn what all the negative traits in that space are. And so we know the publishing, we know. So I'm writing about separatist communities, Black militant communities, that's published by a big five. My editor is a white woman, my agent is a white woman, my publicist is a white man, and I can't claim to be radical writing about radical ideas. So I have to just always remember, like, nobody, like my ancestors didn't show me another way, so I'm stuck here. So I always have to come to terms with art versus commerce, art versus business, and who is profiting off of me as the artist. There's something that, people are critiquing corporate activism, So I know that us writing about social justice issues give a sort of moral capital to our publishers. Our presence as Black women for our publishers give them moral capital. And moral capital means that we're not so bad, we publish social justice books. So that's how I leverage it. And I have to keep doing what I do in that space just so that these books are there for our young people who need it.
Yes, absolutely.
They're not thinking about the big five, they're thinking about the books that are on the shelves in the libraries.
Yeah.
So it's a daily conversation. Every time I'm starting the next book, I'm like, time to make the donuts, I have to be careful that it doesn't feel like a gig,
Yeah.
that
then-
I'm making art.
Yes, and then how do you keep that inspiration up? How do you keep that, that pillar of rest and restoration and, keeping the inspiration and the focus on the things that you want? Like that feels like a practice in itself of just staying present of like, this is the work that I'm creating and this is my why. Like what is your why with this 10th book coming up, which is so extraordinary? How do you sustain that?
I love the writing process more than being an author. I don't know if that's true for everyone.
I feel that way.
Yeah, I'm writing something and I love the discovery, the research, the language, the things that come up, especially if I'm trying something new. Once it's out of my hands, I'm like, next one, I'm chasing the high of the creative process, not the high of the accolades, because you can't control that at all. I prefer the journey of creating something new rather than, I love being in a space like this with you all. This does not happen all the time. I'm talking about a room full of people of color, Black women. No. This is a rarity for me. And when it does happen, I make sure that it happens. And you're one of the people who are making it happen, trust. Let me tell you, as young adult authors, we are mostly in predominantly white spaces. And for me, writing an immigrant book, I was sent to private schools, boarding schools. And those are fine too, but it can be draining. But what fuels my energy is talking to us. And I'm headed to Dallas to like an African American book festival, you know. I will go. They were like, yes, I'll go, you know, to Dallas to an African American book festival with like a Swahili name to it. I'm there. So that's what keeps me going, the creative work, but authorship within a predominantly white institution can be draining if you have a certain mindset. So some people love it, enjoy it, and are validated by it. Others, like me, are drained by it because it requires you to constantly educate and like, you know, like change up what you're saying. You can't be too deep. I can't say Umar Johnson in like Wichita, Kentucky. You know what I mean? I can, but I always have to like double check. So all of that is exhausting, so I stay focused on what fuels me, you know? So yeah, that's how I keep going.
Yeah. So what about you, Jen? What fuels you? I know you like desserts.
I do. I love sugar.
What else fuels you and keeps you focused on your creative goals and writing, especially with the volume of writing that you do?
Yeah, I'm like Evie. I love the writing process because I've invested so much time and money, like going to workshops and residencies when I've been able to get them in that. And it also helps me become a better editor because then you're coming to this with similar questions. And so anyone who is like worked with me knows that like I ask a lot of questions or I make suggestions and stuff like that. I look at it at a very kind of micro level. And so that fuels me because I worked in the industry. I mean, I technically still do, but I worked in the industry for 20 years. Like I was in a production and then I did acquisitions. I did media for a little bit. And I'm in those spaces that, you know, like Evie as author is in these spaces. But then you as worker are in these spaces. And you may be in whatever, I don't know, I might be doing production on Evie's book, right? Where I'm like making sure it's copy edited and proofread and stuff like that. And that can be a journey if like someone's questioning everything Evie's writing. Because we got a copy editor who doesn't understand or didn't care or is like thinking about the grammar, the English grammar. And so then you're making those kind of things. And that can be draining when you hear how people talk about you as a product, when you hear how people explain the quote unquote failure of your book. Because, you know, to us as artists, like, this is a success. Even getting published can be a success, but then it's like, well, you didn't make your numbers. But it's like, what the hell does that mean? Right. And so that is something I compartmentalize a lot, was like there is the business of writing, and then there is the creativity of writing. And I've always enjoyed the creativity of writing. Yeah. I've enjoyed all of the aspects of just understanding, even when I'm stuck, and being in community with people who want to help me get there, or learning from other people like Tiari Jones or Leslie Necker-Arima or Rita Williams-Garcia or Jacqueline Woodson. And, you know, we just learn and learn and learn from each other, right? And so that fuels me because I know I always have an abundance of stories to tell and I'm excited about telling them. But woo, when you get to that business side, like Evie said, it is draining and it can take something away. So you have to protect it too. And compartmentalization, whether it's healthy or not healthy, I don't know. That'll be something I discuss with my therapist next week. It just fuels me, is that I'm able to be like, okay, and just compartmentalize what I need to do to be able to focus on the task at hand.
Yeah. I just want to just take a second to just offer gratitude again, because I feel like you both are providing models for us, especially when it comes to the space of like speaking for young people, encouraging them to use their voice, to really tackle these complicated ideas. I read a lot of Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley High.
Same.
And all these things that felt very superficial and light and fluffy. And not that we don't need those things, but it wasn't until I was much older that I was able to practice this like level of rigor in analyzing ideas. And I think that like young people have that ability to look at things in a more complex way. So I'm just eager to hear more of your just like dedication to like pushing these really grand and complicated ideas on young people and saying like, here, figure it out. Like, it's okay for you to talk about all these radical notions or things that you don't understand and ask questions. That just feels so brave in a space where we're actually like pushing that aside and saying, no, don't do that. Don't expose kids to this. Let's ban books, right? We're like in this banned book era and saying like, let's protect them. And the reality, protecting them actually like means exposing them, showing them these things, giving them an avenue to ask questions. So how do you feel with everything being, now we're in a library and there's this political landscape, there's this space where people are saying, no, don't show this to kids. And you all as author are saying, yes, I am choosing to make this decision and to write about these ideas because it gives kids more agency and more power.
I have 3 books on my shelves at home that I stole from my high school library in 1993 and 1994. That first book is Alex Haley's Queen. I still have it. And the second one was Possessing the Secret of, Temple of My Familiar by Alice Walker.
Yep.
The hardcover with the shiny, with the clear plastic over it. And Something in the Dark. Something in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination by Toni Morrison.
Yeah, yep.
I was like 15 and 16. I don't know why I picked those books. Now I do.
Yeah.
But I was looking for a certain kind of rigor that I was not getting in my high school.
Yeah.
They were on my library shelf for whatever reason. Queen starring Halle Berry had just come out.
Yeah.
So and I'm aging my, and it was on the shelf. So I was that kid because people tend, when we're writing these books, and I'll see the critiques like, this is too difficult for our kids. Hello, I was reading Canterbury Tales. Yeah. Scarlet Letter, all the Shakespeare books, not even the fun ones. I was reading like Midsummer Night's Dream or something like that. And Red Badge of Courage, these like real boring white books. And we tend to forget that this is what was assigned and this is what's still being assigned. Why not give rigor, that same level of rigor, and center children of color in these stories?
Pride and Prejudice isn't like a easy book, right? No. But and folks are like that you're required to read that in school. Like it's a conversation and it's a teaching piece instead of something like no. Yeah.
So I wrote a retelling of Pride and Prejudice called Pride. American Street is in the schools. There are people teaching it, but we seem to forget that we've had to read complex books in high school. We weren't reading Dr. Seuss in the 10th grade.
Right. So what would you say to that, Jen?
I agree, and also I have got to admit I'm a little bitter. You know what I mean? Like maybe to a fault, there are some books by Steinbeck I like, but Moby Dick, sitting here and be like, what's the symbolism of saying cough and help? I've never forgot that. That's how much that's in my head. I'm like, what is the truth? And I'm just like, I don't know. I'm like 14, man. Like, I don't get what you're saying to this. Like, do I pass the Regents? Like, what is happening here? So I think there's a bitterness for me that kind of fuels the subject matter that I focus on, because I want those questions that I just trusted what people told me when I was young. I'm like, you're telling me this? That's how it is. Okay. I'm just going with it. And then you realize like, oh, this is not how it is. And it wasn't as though people were intentionally lying, but that's where the well-intention comes, right? It's that, you're following what is part of the syllabi, right? This is what you're supposed to read to pass a test. This is what you should know. Girls are supposed to be appropriate. Don't have sex. You'll get pregnant. It's just like these kind of blanket things that then in my 20s and 30s, you're like re-educating yourself. And you're like, well, I'm a little bitter about that because I feel like I wish folks had embraced me to be able to tell me these things, but I think that also represents something that they're not ready to talk about too within their family. And so it's not as though I'm angry. It's just like, I want to talk about sexuality. Sexuality is part of this for Letta, where she has to admit that she is not ready to have sex and a guy's pressuring her to have sex. And to show, and I was very consistent where people were like, well, is he like really her? And I said, I do not want him to force her. I want him like physically force her. I wanted him to kind of like go after her, which isn't necessarily better, but I didn't want a physical altercation that led to that for her. I wanted it to be recognized that she was uncomfortable. And that was important for me to showcase, of like discomfort is recognized and that's valid for someone to stop.
Yeah.
And that's enough
Yeah.
for someone to stop.
Yeah. So
Which is-
explaining consent. Yeah.
Right, and not over and be didactic, right? It's like to understand that this is what happens and that it's okay to push back. It's okay to not be sure. It's okay to not do these things in a way that I wish was said to me or was open to me. Because for sex, especially, my mom kind of threw a book at me of like, here's a sex book, and it's like, this is what your privates look like, and And it's just so like, technical. Yeah. It wasn't like really talking about feelings and emotions and pressures and stuff like that. And then you kind of experience this, and it's those ups and downs that if I can write a little bit more about, I don't know if anyone can avoid any of the harshness in life. I'm not trying to protect everybody from everything that ever happens, but it's to that point of, I would like you to know that this exists. Yeah. I would like you to know, again, that you have power, especially in a femme body, that you can say no, that people might expect things of you, that people might shame you, but you saying what you want to say and acknowledging how you feel is never wrong. At the same time. So I think that's part of it for me is I was reading Babysitter's Club and it was very like watching Saved by the Bell and it was very distant, but it was entertaining, but it wasn't relatable. And so those things, I wanted a bit more relatability. Like Degrassi was the most relatable thing for me, if people remember.
Yeah. To close out, we've been talking about power, agency, consent, all these like really important ideas and notions that we need to like have our young people grapple with. I would just love to hear if a young person picks up your book today and they read it, what are you hoping they take away and what do you hope they like really hold with them? Like what is the one line from Nigeria Jones? What is the one line from Forgive Me Not that you want to really resonate with the young people who read it?
So I wrote a book that I would have wanted to read at 16. And one thing I do want to say about writing about Black girls is it seems to me, and in our business, the people who read it first are usually reviewers or librarians or educators before it actually gets to the hands of the child who will needs it the most. It seems to me, and as a parent too, I don't think the wider readership, and I don't want to really talk about the wider readership, don't believe that Black children can be highly intelligent, even if they're not in predominantly white schools, even if they're not in private schools, that you could be in the hood in a low-performing school and be very intelligent too. And that has been some push, if I got any pushback, that's the pushback. And for Nigeria Jones, who's very well read, because I was like, she was given the material, she knows who she is, and with them banning African American studies all over the country, and we have to acknowledge freedom schools. I'm glad that there are educators in Florida who are starting freedom schools. Freedom schools existed and continue to exist where our children know who they are. Howard is right down the block or whatever. There are Professor Carr. I watch Professor Carr on YouTube.
Shout out to Professor Carr.
Right. So when we put them on the page, they're real. Yeah. So I would want any person reading this, and it doesn't just have to be a Black girl, to know that we can be highly intelligent without having been to certain kind of institutions, without having read certain books. My character did not read any Shakespeare, but she has a full command of the English language. That's possible, and that's real. So, and this is framed within the Constitution. She revises parts of the Constitutions in order to create a Constitution for herself. And I wanted readers to think about where they fit into the founding documents of this country. what was edited out of this book, there were essays. They were essays about all the Black girls that had relations with the Founding Fathers. And we forgot, don't know in terms of our, what's taught in the schools, about Ona Judge being 16, and George Washington searching high and low to get her back. Sally Hemings we know about. We don't talk about the native girl, Sacagawea, and how she had a baby on her back leading the Lewis and Clark expedition across the, to the Atlantic, to the Pacific. So I wanted, but they edited out, but when I do talk about it, I want to talk about the role of teenage girls, Black, African, and Indigenous, in their role in their relationships to the Founding Fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Washington, George Washington, the unnamed ones that have not been documented.
I mean, one of the biggest lines is like, you were more than your mistakes. And so that's something that is said to Violetta by folks in the book. And then she comes to believe it because she's taking on so much. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that, we are flawed, we are going to make mistakes, however you feel, if they're big, little, whatever that means to you in measurement. But we are more than that. We move on, we grow, hopefully, and we can do better. And we can do better by the people we care about. And there are just also going to be people who never forgive you. And you kind of have to live with that, right? There are people who feel a way about me, and I have to respect that for whatever it is. But you grow and you do better. And I think that's the biggest thing, is just not to move on, but to move forward. And so there's a line on one of the postcards I have. It's like, I don't want to forget, I want to move forward. And that contributes to her growth. And I think that's kind of like a good way to just live life. It's like, I don't want to forget what's happened, but I do want to move forward towards healing.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Glory. Thank you so much.
We have books available. We have free books available. Forgive Me Not and Nigeria Jones, courtesy of the DC Library Foundation and Loyalty Bookstore. They're right outside. If you want to, you can have.
Repeat the word free.
Free. Did you hear that part? So please have your book signed. And support your library. Support your
We
library.
love a library.
If you don't have your library cards, you can sign up for it. And we will be back in September 20th, and we'll be reading One Blood by Deneen Miller. It comes out September 5th. So please check that out. Thank you all for coming. I really
Thank you,
appreciate
Glory.
it.
Thank you all. Thank you, DC Library.